Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like whispered secrets, there exists a bloodline so cursed that local historians refuse to document their legacy. The Allen family arrived in Pike County, Kentucky in 1847, carrying with them something far more dangerous than the debts and scandals that drove them from Virginia. They brought a hunger that would consume generations, a darkness that would transform a simple mountain clan into something that defied the natural order itself. What you're about to hear isn't found in any genealogy records or county histories. These are the stories that get buried along with the evidence, tales so disturbing that even the oldest mountain folk speak of them only in hushed tones when winter winds howl through the hollows. The Allen name became synonymous with disappearances, with livestock found drained of blood, with children who aged backwards, and elders who never seemed to die. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the Allen lineage appeared in 1851, just 4 years after their arrival. That winter, the harshest in living memory, claimed dozens of lives throughout the region. Families huddled in their cabins, burning furniture for warmth, watching their children grow thin and hollow-eyed from hunger. Yet the Allens not only survived, they thrived. Their livestock remained healthy while others perished. Their children grew plump and rosy-cheeked, while neighbors' offspring wasted away. Most unsettling of all, the Allen family seemed to grow larger during those brutal months, adding members who appeared overnight with no explanation of their origins. The family patriarch, Ezekiel Allen, claimed these newcomers were distant relatives fleeing hardship in other states. But locals noticed troubling details. These supposed relatives bore no resemblance to the Allen bloodline, yet within weeks of their arrival, they began to display the same distinctive characteristics. Their eyes developed an unusual golden hue that reflected lamplight like those of nocturnal animals. Their skin took on a waxy pallor that never seemed to flush with warmth, even when sitting directly beside roaring fires. Most disturbing, they all shared the same unsettling habit of speaking in perfect unison when questioned about their past. Martha Henderson, who lived in the nearest hollow to the Allen property, kept a detailed journal throughout those early years. Her entries, discovered decades later hidden beneath floorboards during a cabin renovation, provide the only contemporary account of the Allen family's activities. She wrote of hearing strange singing echoing from their direction on moonless nights, melodies that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than human throats. She described seeing lights moving through the Allen property in patterns that defied explanation, dancing in perfect geometric formations before vanishing entirely. But it was Martha's final entry, dated February 14th, 1852, that revealed the true nature of what the Allens had brought to Pike County. She wrote of discovering her youngest daughter, Sarah, standing at the edge of their property in the dead of night, staring transfixed toward the Allen homestead. When Martha approached, she found Sarah's lips moving silently, as if reciting words to a song only she could hear. The child's eyes had taken on that same golden reflection that marked the Allen family, and when Martha tried to lead her back to the cabin, Sarah spoke in a voice that wasn't her own. "The family grows," Sarah said in the slow, measured cadence that characterized Allen's speech. "The blood calls to blood." Martha's journal ends there. 3 days later, Both she and Sarah vanished without a trace. Their cabin was found undisturbed, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. The only clue to their fate was a single golden feather left on Martha's pillow, though no bird species in the region possessed such plumage. The disappearances continued with increasing frequency throughout the 1850s. Entire families would vanish overnight, leaving behind homes that showed no evidence of violence or hurried departure. Personal belongings remained undisturbed, meals sat half-finished on tables, livestock continued grazing in pastures as if their owners had simply evaporated. The only common thread connecting these disappearances was their proximity to Allen property and the discovery of those mysterious golden feathers at each scene. Local authorities initially attributed the vanishings to the harsh mountain conditions and the general lawlessness of the region. Pike County was remote, dangerous territory where federal marshals feared to tread and where families often relocated without notice to escape debts or feuds. But as the disappearances mounted, even the most skeptical officials began to acknowledge that something unnatural was occurring. Sheriff William Combmes, a pragmatic man who had served in the Mexican War and considered himself immune to mountain superstitions, made the decision to investigate the Allen family directly in the spring of 1854. His official report, filed with the state capitol but never acted upon, makes for chilling reading. Combmes described approaching the Allen homestead just after dawn, expecting to find a typical mountain settlement. Instead, he discovered a property that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight despite the morning sun. The Allen buildings appeared normal from a distance, but as Combmes drew closer, he noticed disturbing details. The shadows cast by their structures fell in directions that contradicted the sun's position. The air around their property carried an unusual chill and a metallic scent that reminded him of battlefields after heavy fighting. Most unsettling, the sounds of normal life that should have emanated from a large family compound were completely absent. No children's laughter, no livestock sounds, no conversation or movement of any kind. When Combmes finally reached the main house and knocked on the door, he was greeted by Ezekiel Allen himself. The family patriarch appeared unchanged from their first meeting 3 years earlier, showing no signs of aging despite the passage of time. Ezekiel's greeting was cordial but strange, as if he had been expecting the sheriff's visit and had prepared carefully for the encounter. "Sheriff Combmes," Ezekiel said before any introductions had been made, "how kind of you to visit our humble home." Combmes later wrote that Ezekiel's voice carried an odd quality, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect synchronization. The sound seemed to come from several directions at once, creating an echo effect that made conversation deeply unsettling. When Combmes asked to speak with other family members, Ezekiel explained that they were all engaged in important work that couldn't be interrupted. "We're a close family, Sheriff," Ezekiel explained with a smile that revealed the teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous. "We share everything, our joys, our sorrows, our very essence. When one of us speaks, we all speak." Combmes attempted to question Ezekiel about the recent disappearances, but found his thoughts becoming increasingly clouded the longer he remained on the property. His official report describes a growing sense of disorientation, as if the world around him was slowly shifting into something that resembled reality but operated by different rules. time seemed to move differently within the boundaries of the Allen land. Minutes stretched into hours, yet the sun's position never changed. He saw figures moving through the Allen house who cast no reflections in windows, heard conversations in languages that predated human speech, and witnessed family members who appeared to be different ages each time he glimpsed them. A child would seem to be perhaps 8 years old when viewed directly, but their shadow would suggest the proportions of a full-grown adult. Combmes fled the Allen property in what he later admitted was a state of panic. He resigned his position 2 weeks later and moved his family to Ohio, refusing to discuss his experiences for the remainder of his life. The Allen family's influence continued to spread throughout the 1850s and 1860s. Their property expanded mysteriously, with boundary markers appearing overnight to claim land that had previously belonged to vanished families. Local records show that these acquisitions were always properly documented, with deeds bearing the signatures of the missing property owners. However, handwriting experts who examined these documents decades later noted that all the signatures, regardless of the supposed signatory, were written by the same hand. The Civil War brought temporary relief to Pike County, as many of the region's young men departed to fight for the Union or Confederate cause. The Allen family claimed neutrality, stating that their loyalties lay with older allegiances that transcended the current conflict. They provided supplies to both armies when requested, though soldiers from both sides reported feeling uncomfortable during their visits to Allen property. Captain James Morrison of the 14th Kentucky Infantry wrote to his wife about a particularly disturbing encounter with the Allen family in 1863. His unit had been pursuing Confederate raiders through the mountains when they sought shelter at the Allen homestead during a severe thunderstorm. The family welcomed them warmly, providing hot food and dry lodging for the night. Morrison noted that despite the Allen family's apparent hospitality, his men remained on edge throughout their stay. The soldiers reported hearing whispered conversations in empty rooms, seeing faces in windows that vanished when looked at directly, and experiencing shared nightmares featuring the same recurring imagery of golden feathers and underground chambers filled with sleeping figures. Most disturbing was Morrison's observation that several of his men appeared to be aging rapidly during their single night at the Allen property. Soldiers who had entered the house as young men in their 20s emerged the following morning with gray hair and deep lines around their eyes. 2 members of his unit, previously among his most reliable fighters, seemed to have difficulty remembering their own names and had to be reminded of basic military procedures. Morrison ordered his men to depart at first light, but discovered that 3 soldiers had vanished during the night. The missing men's equipment remained in the rooms where they had slept, arranged neatly as if they had simply evaporated from within their uniforms. When Morrison questioned the Allen family about the disappearances, Ezekiel responded with that same unsettling synchronized voice. "Young men are so full of life," he said, while his family members nodded in perfect unison. "Sometimes that vitality finds better purposes than warfare. Your soldiers have joined a different kind of service now, Captain." The war's end in 1865 brought new challenges to the Allen family as federal authorities began to take a more active interest in the remote regions of Kentucky. Reconstruction efforts included surveying and mapping projects that threatened to expose the full extent of the Allen property and the mysterious circumstances surrounding their land acquisitions. Government surveyors arrived in Pike County in 1867, tasked with creating accurate maps of the region for tax assessment purposes. The three-man team, led by experienced cartographer Thomas Brennan, began their work with confidence. They had successfully mapped dozens of counties throughout Kentucky and considered themselves immune to the superstitions and tall tales that surrounded mountain communities. Brennan's survey notes, preserved in the National Archives, document the team's growing confusion as they attempted to map the Allen property. Their instruments consistently produced contradictory readings when used within the family's boundaries. Compass needles would spin wildly or point in directions that defied magnetic principles. Measuring chains would produce different results when used to measure the same distance twice. Most frustrating, the boundaries of the Allen property seemed to shift between measurements, expanding and contracting in ways that made accurate mapping impossible. The survey team's final report was never completed. Brennan's notes end abruptly on October 13, 1867, with a brief entry that reads simply, "The land remembers, the family grows." All three surveyors were found 3 days later, sitting in perfect stillness around their campfire. They showed no signs of injury or illness, but appeared to have aged decades in a matter of days. None of them could recall their names or the purpose of their mission. The surveyors were returned to their families, but never fully recovered their memories or their youth. They spent their remaining years speaking in the same synchronized manner that characterized the Allen family, often reciting information about land boundaries and property rights for counties they had never visited. By the 1870s, the Allen family had achieved a form of immunity from outside interference. Government officials learned to avoid their property. Local law enforcement refused to investigate complaints involving the family, and neighboring communities developed elaborate systems of warnings and protective rituals designed to prevent unwanted Allen attention. The family had become a force of nature in Pike County, as inevitable and dangerous as avalanches or flash floods. Yet it was during this period of seeming security that the first cracks began to appear in the Allen family's unity. Local residents reported seeing strange lights emanating from the Allen property that pulsed in patterns suggesting conflict or distress. The synchronized speech that had characterized the family for decades began to show discordant notes, with different voices occasionally contradicting each other before falling back into harmony. The source of this discord appeared to be a young woman who had joined the family under circumstances that remain unclear to this day. Known only as Constance, she possessed the golden eyes and waxy complexion that marked all Allen family members, but retained a spark of individual will that had been absent in previous additions to their number. Local observers noted that when Constance spoke, her words were her own rather than the collective voice of the family. Constance began appearing in the nearby town of Pikeville, always alone and always at twilight. She would purchase supplies using currency that appeared to be genuine but bore dates from decades in the future. Shopkeepers who served her reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness in her presence, as if she carried the weight of tremendous loss. Unlike other Allen family members, Constance seemed to age normally, showing signs of the passage of time that made her increasingly distinct from her unchanging relatives. The growing tension within the Allen family reached a breaking point in the winter of 1878. Residents throughout Pike County reported hearing what sounded like a tremendous argument emanating from the Allen property. Voices raised in anger, using languages that predated human settlement in the region. The dispute continued for 3 days and nights, accompanied by lights that danced across the sky in patterns that resembled aerial warfare. On the fourth morning, silence returned to the Allen property. When brave souls ventured close enough to investigate, they discovered that the main Allen house had been reduced to ash and blackened timbers. The fire had burned so intensely that the stone foundation had cracked and melted, yet the surrounding forest showed no signs of heat damage. The blaze had consumed only the structures associated with the Allen family, leaving even nearby outbuildings untouched. No bodies were found in the ruins, but searchers discovered something that would haunt Pike County for generations to come. Buried beneath the collapsed cellar was a chamber that extended deep into the earth, its walls lined with alcoves that had clearly been designed to hold human occupants. Each alcove contained personal effects from the families that had vanished over the previous 3 decades: wedding rings, children's toys, family photographs, and other intimate possessions arranged with ritualistic precision. At the center of this underground chamber stood a circular altar carved from a single piece of black stone. The altar's surface was covered with symbols that resembled no known writing system, though local clergy who examined them reported feeling an immediate sense of revulsion and spiritual oppression. Most disturbing were the channels carved into the altar's surface, clearly designed to collect and direct the flow of liquid toward a central basin that still contained traces of what appeared to be blood from multiple sources. The discovery of this chamber finally provided an explanation for the decades of disappearances that had plagued Pike County. The missing families hadn't been killed in any conventional sense, but had been absorbed into some form of collective existence that sustained the Allen family's unnatural longevity. The personal effects in the alcoves suggested that the victims had retained their individual identities even after their physical transformation, trapped in a state between life and death that allowed the Allen family to draw upon their life force indefinitely. But the chamber also revealed the source of the conflict that had apparently destroyed the Allen homestead. Among the alcoves was one that had been violently torn apart, its contents scattered and burned. The destruction appeared to have been caused from within, as if one of the absorbed victims had somehow regained enough individual will to rebel against their captivity. The damaged alcove contained items that had belonged to a young woman whose description matched Constance, suggesting that she had somehow escaped the collective consciousness that bound the Allen family together. The aftermath of the Allen homestead's destruction brought temporary peace to Pike County. The disappearances ceased, the strange lights no longer danced across the night sky, and the sense of oppressive dread that had characterized the region for 3 decades began to lift. Local residents cautiously began to reclaim the territories that had been abandoned during the height of the Allen family's influence. However, this peace proved to be temporary. Within a year of the homestead's destruction, reports began to surface of Allen family members appearing in distant locations throughout Appalachia. Unlike their previous concentrated presence in Pike County, the family now seemed to be spreading across the mountain region, establishing smaller settlements in isolated hollows where their activities would attract less attention. These new Allen settlements followed a different pattern than their original homestead. Rather than expanding aggressively and absorbing neighboring families, they maintained careful isolation and avoided contact with outside communities. The family members who established these outposts appeared to have learned from the mistakes that had led to their previous exposure, adopting more subtle methods of sustaining themselves while avoiding the kind of large-scale disappearances that had eventually drawn unwanted attention. The dispersal of the Allen family marked the beginning of a new and more insidious phase of their existence. No longer concentrated in a single location where their activities could be monitored and potentially contained, they became a distributed threat that was far more difficult to track or combat. Local authorities in multiple states began reporting isolated incidents that bore the hallmarks of Allen family involvement: unexplained disappearances, livestock found drained of blood, and witnesses who aged rapidly after encountering mysterious strangers with golden eyes. The Allen family had learned to adapt, to survive, and to spread their influence across a wider territory than ever before. What had begun as a localized threat in Pike County, Kentucky, had evolved into a regional phenomenon that would continue to plague Appalachian communities for generations to come. The dispersal of the Allen bloodline across Appalachia following the Homestead fire marked not an end but a transformation. Where once a single family had wielded concentrated malevolence, now dozens of smaller cells spread their influence like poison through mountain streams. Each fragment carried the same dark knowledge, the same hunger for power, the same willingness to sacrifice others for their own unnatural preservation. By the 1880s, investigators tracking the Allen influence faced a new challenge. The family no longer operated as a unified entity, but as a network of interconnected bloodlines, each adapting their practices to local conditions while maintaining their core supernatural abilities. What emerged was perhaps more dangerous than the original homestead ever was: a distributed system of corruption that proved nearly impossible to eradicate. The first documented post-fire Allen settlement appeared in Breathitt County, Kentucky in 1881. Residents of the isolated community of Wolf Pen noticed the arrival of 3 families who claimed to be distant cousins fleeing economic hardship in Pennsylvania. The newcomers, calling themselves the Allens, Aldrich, and Ashford families, purchased adjacent properties along a remote creek valley using gold coins that local merchants noted were unusually old and bore no recognizable mint marks. Within months, the familiar patterns began to emerge. Livestock in neighboring farms began suffering from the same mysterious blood loss that had plagued Pike County decades earlier. Children in the valley developed the same unsettling behavioral changes, speaking in unison and displaying knowledge far beyond their years. Most disturbing, the 3 families seemed to share a collective consciousness, with members of each household somehow aware of events occurring in the others. A circuit judge investigating reports of strange activities in the valley left behind detailed notes before his own disappearance in 1884. He described finding the 3 homesteads connected by a network of underground tunnels, similar to those discovered at the original Allen property. Within these subterranean chambers, he observed the same black stone altars, the same collections of personal effects from vanished families, and evidence of rituals that appeared to be growing more sophisticated and elaborate. The judge's final journal entry, found weeks later in his hotel room, detailed his most disturbing discovery. The three families had not simply recreated their old practices, but had evolved them. They had begun experimenting with what he termed ritual breeding, deliberately intermarrying in patterns dictated by their supernatural beliefs. Children born from these unions displayed abilities that surpassed even those of their parents, including the capacity to influence the thoughts and actions of ordinary people from considerable distances. This expansion of Allen influence represented a fundamental shift in their approach to survival and power. Rather than maintaining a single, vulnerable stronghold, they had learned to create multiple centers of influence that could support and protect each other. When one settlement faced investigation or threat, the others would orchestrate distractions or eliminate threats before they could act. The network grew rapidly throughout the 1880s and 1890s. Allen descendants established footholds in remote areas of Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina, always following the same pattern. They would arrive in small groups, claiming to be refugees or displaced families seeking new opportunities. They would purchase isolated properties, often paying well above market value to ensure seller cooperation. Within a year or two, the surrounding communities would begin experiencing the familiar signs of Allen influence. What made this expansion particularly insidious was how the Allen descendants had learned to camouflage their activities within the existing culture of mountain feuds and clan violence. When families disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, it was often attributed to ongoing vendettas or the harsh realities of mountain life. The Allen network exploited these assumptions, using the region's reputation for lawlessness as cover for their supernatural predations. Local law enforcement, already stretched thin across vast mountain territories, found themselves facing phenomena they could neither understand nor adequately investigate. Sheriff's deputies reported strange experiences when attempting to patrol Allen territories, including equipment malfunctions, disorientation, and encounters with figures that seemed to vanish when approached directly. Many officers simply began avoiding these areas entirely, creating de facto autonomous zones where the Allen families could operate without interference. The network's influence extended beyond mere geographical expansion. Allen descendants had learned to infiltrate existing power structures, using their supernatural abilities to gain positions of influence in local governments, churches, and business communities. A merchant who had been subtly influenced by Allen powers might find himself compelled to extend credit to Allen families while denying it to their enemies. A pastor might discover himself preaching sermons that unknowingly incorporated Allen beliefs, slowly corrupting his congregation's spiritual practices. By 1890, researchers tracking the Allen phenomenon estimated that their influence had spread to at least 12 counties across 4 states. Each settlement maintained its own variations of the original rituals, adapting to local conditions and opportunities. Mountain communities that had once been isolated by geography now found themselves connected by an invisible network of supernatural influence that could coordinate activities across hundreds of miles. Unlike their earlier practices of simply preying upon existing communities. The dispersed Allen families had learned to actively convert outsiders to their cause. Desperate individuals, those facing financial ruin, family tragedies, or social ostracism, would be approached with offers of assistance that came with hidden costs. These recruitment ceremonies took place in specially prepared locations, often natural formations like caves or groves that the Allen families had modified with their ritual implements. Potential converts would be brought to these sites during times of personal crisis and offered solutions to their problems in exchange for participation in seemingly harmless ceremonies. Only after multiple sessions would the true nature of their commitment become clear, by which point the psychological and supernatural bonds had grown too strong to break. The children of these converted families proved particularly valuable to the Allen network. Born into the hybrid culture of mountain tradition and Allen supernatural practice, they could move freely between normal society and the hidden network, serving as scouts, messengers, and agents of influence. These second-generation allies often proved more effective than the original Allen bloodline members at expanding the network's reach, as they aroused less suspicion and could more easily establish themselves in new communities. When an Allen family member died, their accumulated supernatural power and knowledge would be ceremonially transferred to younger relatives through elaborate rites involving the consumption of prepared flesh and blood. This practice ensured that the network's capabilities grew stronger with each generation rather than diminishing, as the combined experiences and abilities of multiple lifetimes were concentrated into individual survivors. The distributed nature of the Allen network made it nearly impossible to combat using conventional law enforcement methods. When authorities moved against one settlement, the others would be warned through supernatural means, allowing them to hide evidence, eliminate witnesses, or simply abandon their locations temporarily. The network had learned to operate like a living organism, sacrificing individual cells when necessary to preserve the whole. State and federal investigators attempting to track the Allen influence found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Planned raids would find empty buildings and cold trails. Witnesses would disappear or recant their testimony. Evidence would be destroyed in mysterious fires or simply vanish from supposedly secure locations. Even investigators who managed to gather significant intelligence often found themselves plagued by personal tragedies or psychological breakdowns that forced them to abandon their work. The Allen network's influence on regional culture proved equally profound and disturbing. Traditional mountain folklore began incorporating elements that reflected Allen beliefs and practices. Stories of helpful spirits that demanded blood offerings, of families blessed with supernatural abilities, of ancient powers dwelling in the deepest hollers became common throughout areas of Allen influence. These cultural changes helped normalize and disguise the network's activities, making it difficult for outsiders to distinguish between harmless local superstition and evidence of genuine supernatural corruption. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Allen network had achieved something unprecedented in American history. They had created a parallel society within the mountain regions, one that operated according to supernatural laws rather than civil or religious authority. Their influence touched thousands of lives across multiple states, creating a hidden infrastructure of power that would prove nearly impossible to dismantle. The true scope of the Allen network's reach became apparent only when viewed from a regional perspective. What appeared to be isolated incidents of violence, disappearances, and strange phenomena across Appalachia revealed itself as part of a coordinated pattern when examined collectively. The Allen descendants had not simply survived the destruction of their original homestead, but had used that crisis as an opportunity to evolve into something far more dangerous and persistent. Their transformation from a single malevolent family into a distributed network of supernatural influence represented a new phase in the Allen legacy, one that would prove even more difficult to combat than their original concentrated presence. The mountains themselves seemed to have become complicit in their expansion, providing the isolation and concealment necessary for their continued growth and evolution. The century would end with the Allen network firmly established across the Appalachian region, their influence woven so deeply into the fabric of mountain life that distinguishing between their supernatural corruption and the natural hardships of the area had become nearly impossible. The destruction of the Allen homestead in 1878 meant nothing to them. Fire couldn't burn what had already dissolved into shadow and mist. By the 1880s, the Allen bloodline had evolved beyond the need for a single location, beyond the limitations of traditional family structure. They had become something far more insidious, far more dangerous. A network of corruption that stretched across state lines, woven into the very fabric of Appalachian society, like a cancer that had learned to hide in healthy tissue. What authorities discovered during the 1880s and 1890s would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of evil itself. The Allens hadn't been destroyed by that fire. They had been liberated from the last constraints of their physical existence, and in that liberation, they had found ways to multiply their influence that defied every law of nature and reason. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came in the winter of 1881. A circuit judge named Cornelius Whitmore was traveling through Pike County when his horse threw him near what had once been the Allen property. As he lay injured in the snow, unable to move, he reported later that he heard voices singing in perfect harmony, though no buildings remained standing for miles. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything he had ever heard, and it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Judge Whitmore described feeling compelled to dig into the frozen ground with his bare hands, following the sound. 3 feet down, his fingers found what he initially thought was a root system. But as he cleared away more dirt, he realized he was looking at an intricate network of what appeared to be veins or arteries, pale and translucent, pulsing with a faint luminescence. When he touched them, images flooded his mind, faces he didn't recognize, places he had never been, and most disturbing of all, detailed knowledge of crimes that had been committed decades before his birth. The judge managed to crawl to safety, but the experience changed him permanently. Within months, his court decisions became increasingly erratic. He began acquitting defendants who were obviously guilty while condemning innocent people based on what he called deeper truths that only he could perceive. His journals, discovered after his death in 1889, contained detailed maps of underground networks spanning multiple states, along with lists of names and dates that corresponded to unexplained disappearances throughout the region. Most disturbing were his final entries, written in a handwriting that grew increasingly illegible, as though his hand was being guided by someone else. "They are not gone," he wrote. "They are everywhere, in the blood of the children, in the dreams of the elders, in the very stones beneath our feet. The fire did not destroy them." The transformation wasn't limited to individuals. Entire communities began exhibiting signs of Allen influence. Buildings would remain structurally sound but feel hollow, as though the life had been drained from them. Conversations would die mid-sentence, replaced by uncomfortable silences that seemed to stretch on forever. Children stopped playing in the streets, instead gathering in basements and abandoned buildings to engage in activities their parents couldn't quite remember but instinctively feared. In Prestonsburg, Kentucky, the town's most prominent families began intermarrying at an unprecedented rate. The Carvers, the Holbrooks, the Stampers, and the Mayos, families that had maintained careful social distances for generations, suddenly found their children forming intense romantic attachments that led to hasty weddings. The resulting offspring displayed the familiar Allen characteristics: unusual intelligence, preternatural awareness of others' thoughts and emotions, and an ability to influence events in ways that seemed to defy natural law. Dr. Marcus Ellington, a physician who had served the community for over 20 years, documented these changes in his private medical records. "The children born from these unions," he wrote, "exhibit abilities that challenge my understanding of human physiology. They seem to require less sleep, less food, and show remarkable resistance to disease. Most troubling is their apparent ability to communicate without speaking." The doctor's records also noted an alarming pattern in the older generation. They would forget significant events from their own lives while simultaneously gaining detailed knowledge of historical events they couldn't possibly have witnessed. Some claimed to remember the Allen family's arrival in 1847, despite being born years after the Homestead's destruction. The physical manifestations of Allen influence became increasingly bold during this period. Travelers reported encountering family members on remote mountain roads, always appearing exactly as they had been described in the 1860s, unchanged by the passage of time. These encounters followed a disturbing pattern. The Allen family member would approach with apparent friendliness, offering assistance or directions. Once the traveler engaged in conversation, they would find themselves unable to leave, held in place by some invisible force, while the Allen family member spoke in low, hypnotic tones about topics that seemed to reach directly into the listener's deepest fears and desires. Those who survived these encounters, and not all did, reported experiencing a profound sense of loss afterward, as though something essential had been taken from them. Many described feeling as though they were viewing their own lives from a distance, unable to fully engage with their families or communities. Some developed an insatiable hunger for knowledge about the Allen family, abandoning their responsibilities to search for any trace of their continued existence. The network's influence extended far beyond individual encounters. By the mid-1880s, patterns emerged that suggested coordinated manipulation of entire regional systems. Mining accidents increased dramatically, but always in ways that benefited specific families or companies that had connections to the original Allen associates. Political elections began producing results that defied all logical analysis, with candidates who had shown no previous support suddenly winning by overwhelming margins. These were bloodlines that had no direct connection to the original Allen clan, but began exhibiting identical behavioral patterns and supernatural abilities. The Blackwood family of Carter County, the Ashford clan in eastern Tennessee, and the Whitman bloodline in southwestern Virginia all demonstrated the same characteristics: rapid accumulation of wealth and influence, unusual longevity, and the ability to manipulate others through psychological means that bordered on the supernatural. Investigation into these proxy families revealed a common thread. Each had experienced a period of extreme desperation, financial ruin, or personal tragedy shortly before their transformation. During these vulnerable moments, family members reported receiving visits from helpful strangers who offered solutions to their problems. The strangers, invariably described as pale, unusually tall, and possessing an unsettling ability to anticipate their visitors' needs, would propose agreements that seemed almost too good to be true. The agreements always involved some form of exchange. The exact nature of this cooperation was never fully explained, but it involved allowing the stranger to share the family's bloodline through a ritual that combined elements of adoption, marriage, and blood transfusion. Children born after these agreements exhibited the classic Allen traits, but with an important difference. Unlike the original Allen children, who had been raised within the family's belief system, these proxy children grew up in conventional families with no knowledge of their supernatural heritage. This made them far more effective at infiltrating normal society, as they could pass for ordinary individuals while unconsciously serving the network's interests. The proxy system created a multiplication effect that allowed Allen influence to spread exponentially. Each proxy family could create additional proxies, and those could create still more, until the network's reach extended far beyond what any traditional family structure could have achieved. By 1890, investigators estimated that Allen influence had touched over 300 families across 7 states, with new proxies being created at an accelerating rate. The network's operations became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Rather than relying on crude intimidation and violence, they developed subtle methods of control that were nearly impossible to detect. They would identify key individuals in positions of authority: judges, sheriffs, bank presidents, newspaper editors, and gradually expose them to Allen influence through seemingly innocent social interactions. A typical recruitment might begin with a chance encounter at a social gathering where an Allen associate would engage the target in conversation about their interests and concerns. The associate would demonstrate remarkable insight into the target's problems, offering advice that proved uncannily accurate. Follow-up meetings would be arranged, always in locations that felt safe and familiar to the target. Over time, the target would find themselves increasingly dependent on their new friend's counsel, unaware that each interaction was subtly altering their decision-making processes. The Allen associate would gradually introduce concepts and perspectives that aligned with the network's interests, always framing these ideas as the target's own realizations rather than external suggestions. The process was so gradual and so carefully tailored to each individual that most targets never realized they had been compromised. They continued to believe they were making independent decisions, even as their choices increasingly served the network's agenda. This method proved far more effective than direct coercion, as it eliminated the risk of resistance or exposure that came with more obvious forms of manipulation. The network's influence on regional law enforcement became particularly pronounced during the 1890s. A pattern emerged where crimes connected to Allen Associates would be investigated with unusual incompetence, while unrelated criminal activities would be pursued with ruthless efficiency. Evidence would disappear from secure storage facilities. Witnesses would suddenly recant their testimony, and judges would make rulings that seemed to defy legal precedent. Sheriff Samuel Morrison of Floyd County documented his growing suspicions in a series of encrypted letters to his brother in Cincinnati. "There is something wrong with this place," he wrote in 1893. "Cases that should be simple to solve become impossibly complex, while obvious guilt is ignored by everyone around me." Morrison's letters described a growing sense of isolation as he realized that many of his fellow law enforcement officers had been compromised. He began conducting his own investigations, carefully avoiding any contact with local authorities. But his efforts were consistently thwarted by obstacles that seemed to appear from nowhere. Witnesses would move away without notice, documents would be destroyed in convenient accidents, and physical evidence would be contaminated or lost. The sheriff's final letter, dated November 15, 1894, revealed the extent of his despair. "I have discovered that the corruption goes deeper than I ever imagined. It is not simply a matter of individual officers being bribed or intimidated. The entire system has been altered at a fundamental level. Laws are being enforced selectively, not based on justice, but according to some pattern that I cannot fully comprehend." Morrison disappeared 3 days after writing that letter. His body was never found, but his office was discovered in perfect order, with all his official files carefully organized and his personal effects neatly arranged. The only sign of disturbance was his desk calendar, where someone had drawn a small symbol in red ink next to the date of his disappearance. The symbol matched those found at Allen ritual sites decades earlier. The network's influence on economic systems proved equally devastating. By the 1890s, they had developed methods of manipulating markets and financial institutions that allowed them to transfer wealth from legitimate businesses to their own operations with minimal risk of detection. They would identify successful enterprises and gradually insert their associates into key positions: accountants, managers, partners, where they could influence financial decisions. The process was always gradual and carefully planned. Rather than engaging in obvious theft or fraud, they would make small adjustments to business practices that would slowly redirect profits toward network-controlled entities. A mining company might find its most profitable contracts being renegotiated under terms that seemed reasonable but actually favored Allen-associated competitors. A merchant might discover that his most reliable suppliers had been replaced by new vendors who charged slightly higher prices while delivering goods of slightly lower quality. Individual business owners rarely recognized what was happening until it was too late. The changes were so subtle and so gradually implemented that they appeared to be natural market fluctuations rather than coordinated manipulation. By the time a business owner realized they were being systematically undermined, the network had usually gained enough control over their operations to make resistance futile. The psychological impact of these economic manipulations extended far beyond simple financial loss. Business owners who had spent decades building successful enterprises found themselves questioning their own competence as their companies slowly failed despite their best efforts. Many developed severe depression and anxiety, unable to understand why their proven business strategies were no longer effective. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with their confusion and despair, making them even more vulnerable to network manipulation. Others became obsessed with identifying the source of their problems, conducting increasingly desperate investigations that led them into direct contact with Allen associates who were always ready to offer explanations and solutions in exchange for cooperation. This was a coordinated effort to bring multiple forms of influence to bear on a single target simultaneously, creating a psychological environment where resistance became virtually impossible. A typical convergence would begin with economic pressure designed to create financial desperation. As the target struggled with mounting debts and failing business prospects, they would encounter Allen associates who seemed to offer solutions to their problems. Simultaneously, the target's family members would begin experiencing their own difficulties, health problems, social isolation, legal troubles that could also be resolved through cooperation with the network. The target would find themselves surrounded by people who all seemed to be offering the same advice. Accept help from these generous strangers who had appeared so conveniently during their time of need. Friends, family members, business associates, and community leaders would all independently recommend the same course of action, unaware that they were all being influenced by the same network of manipulation. Under this coordinated pressure, even the strongest-willed individuals would eventually capitulate. The alternative, continuing to resist while watching their lives and the lives of their loved ones deteriorate, became psychologically unbearable. Most targets convinced themselves that accepting help from the Allen network was not only reasonable, but the only responsible choice available to them. The convergence technique proved so effective that it became the network's preferred method for recruiting high-value targets. By the end of the 1890s, they had successfully compromised individuals in positions of authority throughout the region, creating a shadow government that operated parallel to official institutions while remaining completely invisible to outside observers. The true extent of Allen influence during this period may never be fully understood. Their operations had become so sophisticated and so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of regional society that separating their activities from normal social and economic processes became virtually impossible. They had achieved something that no criminal organization had ever accomplished before: complete control over a geographic region without anyone realizing that control existed. The network's success during the 1880s and 1890s established the foundation for even more ambitious operations in the decades that followed. They had proven that supernatural abilities, when combined with careful planning and patient execution, could overcome any form of conventional resistance. They had learned to hide in plain sight, to manipulate without being detected, and to control without being recognized as controllers. Most importantly, they had discovered that the most effective form of evil was not the dramatic, obvious kind that inspired resistance, but the subtle, gradual kind that convinced its victims that they were making their own choices. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Allen network had become something unprecedented in human history, a supernatural force that had learned to operate according to natural laws, making it virtually impossible to combat using conventional means. The stage was set for their most ambitious phase yet, one that would see their influence spread far beyond the Appalachian Mountains and into the heart of American society itself. The Allens understood that true power lay not in dramatic displays, but in the quiet accumulation of influence. By the 1890s, their network had evolved into something far more sophisticated than the crude blood rituals of their early years. They had learned to harvest human potential itself, transforming entire bloodlines into unwitting extensions of their collective will. The transformation began with what locals called the choosing season. Every autumn, as the leaves turned crimson and the mountain mist grew thick as wool, families throughout Appalachia would receive visitors. These weren't the crude mountain folk of decades past, but well-dressed individuals with peculiar golden eyes and voices that seemed to bypass the ears entirely. They came bearing gifts, opportunities, solutions to problems that had plagued communities for generations. In Harlan County, the Prescott family had struggled with a failing farm for 3 generations. Their soil had turned barren, their livestock sickened mysteriously, and their debts mounted like winter snow. When the visitor arrived in October 1892, he appeared as a land assessor from a mining company, offering to purchase their worthless property for 10 times its assessed value. The only condition was that the Prescotts remain as caretakers, tending to certain agricultural experiments the company wished to conduct. Within a year, the Prescott land bloomed with a natural abundance. Their crops grew twice as large as neighboring farms. Their cattle multiplied at impossible rates, and their financial troubles evaporated entirely. But the family began to change in subtle ways. Their speech patterns synchronized, often finishing each other's sentences with eerie precision. Their children displayed knowledge they couldn't possibly possess, speaking of events from decades before their birth as though they had witnessed them personally. The agricultural experiments proved to be something far more sinister than crop rotation. In carefully tended plots hidden by dense woodland, the Prescotts cultivated plants that existed in no botanical text. These specimens required specific nutrients, delivered monthly in sealed containers that the family was instructed never to open. The plants themselves were beautiful in an unsettling way, with leaves that shifted color based on the observer's emotional state and flowers that bloomed only during the new moon. More disturbing were the human experiments. The mining company required the Prescotts to host occasional visitors, individuals who arrived sick or injured and departed completely transformed. These guests would spend weeks in specially prepared chambers beneath the farmhouse, rooms that had been excavated and lined with the same black stone found in Allen burial sites throughout the region. The sounds that emerged from these underground spaces defied description, a mixture of anguished screaming and what witnesses described as ecstatic singing. Those who emerged from the chambers bore the telltale signs of Allen influence. Their eyes held flecks of gold. Their skin possessed an unusual pallor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they spoke with the same synchronized cadence that marked all Allen proxies. Most significantly, they displayed abilities that stretched the boundaries of human capability. Sarah Hutchins, a consumptive woman who arrived at the Prescott farm barely able to walk, departed 6 weeks later, not only cured, but possessing what locals described as supernatural strength. She could lift stones that required 3 men to move and reportedly survived a fall from a cliff that should have killed her instantly. When questioned about her recovery, she would only smile and speak of having been chosen for a greater purpose. The Allen network expanded through similar operations across multiple states. In West Virginia, they established what appeared to be a tuberculosis sanatorium, where the afflicted arrived to die and departed as something else entirely. In Tennessee, they operated a series of orphanages that specialized in caring for children with unusual abilities. Youngsters who had survived accidents that should have been fatal or displayed intelligence far beyond their years. These institutions served as processing centers for Allen recruitment. The sick, the desperate, and the abandoned were transformed through processes that combined psychological manipulation with what could only be described as supernatural intervention. The methods varied, but the results remained consistent: complete loyalty to the Allen Collective and the gradual development of abilities that defied natural law. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a physician who investigated several of these facilities, documented his findings in a journal that survived his mysterious disappearance in 1897. His entries described patients who underwent radical personality changes after treatment, individuals who could predict weather patterns with impossible accuracy, sense the presence of others through solid walls, and communicate telepathically across vast distances. Most disturbing were Whitfield's observations of the children in Allen-operated orphanages. These youngsters, many of whom had arrived traumatized and withdrawn, developed into eerily confident individuals who spoke with adult sophistication about topics far beyond their years. They displayed perfect coordination during group activities, moving as though choreographed by an invisible conductor. When one child was injured, others would wince in sympathy, suggesting a shared sensory experience that transcended normal human connection. The doctor's final entry, dated 3 days before his disappearance, described a ceremony he witnessed while hiding in the woods near an Allen facility. Dozens of children and adults gathered in a clearing around a circular pit filled with what appeared to be liquid mercury. One by one, participants approached the pit and allowed a single drop of the substance to touch their forehead. Each individual immediately collapsed, their body convulsing as though experiencing a seizure, before rising with eyes that reflected light, like polished gold. By 1895, the Allen influence had become so pervasive that entire communities operated under their subtle control without conscious awareness of their manipulation. Town councils made decisions that benefited Allen interests while believing they were acting independently. Merchants adjusted their practices to accommodate Allen proxies, justifying these changes as sound business decisions. Law enforcement officers found reasons to avoid investigating Allen-related activities, convincing themselves that their reluctance stemmed from practical considerations rather than supernatural compulsion. The network's sophistication extended to economic manipulation on a regional scale. Allen proxies established banks that offered unusually favorable terms to families in financial distress, creating debt relationships that bound entire bloodlines to Allen's service. They operated mining companies that discovered valuable resources with impossible consistency, always in locations that served broader Allen territorial objectives. Their timber operations harvested lumber from forests that should have been exhausted decades earlier, as though the trees regenerated according to Allen rather than natural growth cycles. Most ingeniously, they infiltrated religious institutions, placing Allen proxies in positions of spiritual authority throughout Appalachian communities. These corrupted ministers preached sermons that subtly prepared their congregations for Allen influence, speaking of chosen bloodlines, supernatural gifts, and the necessity of sacrifice for community prosperity. They conducted baptisms in streams that flowed through Allen territory using water that had been blessed according to ancient rituals that predated Christian influence in the region. The religious corruption proved particularly effective because it provided theological justification for Allen activities. Mysterious healings were attributed to divine intervention rather than supernatural manipulation. Prophetic dreams that guided community decisions were interpreted as messages from God rather than Allen telepathic influence. The gradual transformation of community members was celebrated as spiritual awakening rather than recognized as systematic possession. Marriage arrangements became another vector for Allen expansion. Proxy families arranged unions that served Allen breeding objectives while appearing to follow traditional courtship patterns. These marriages produced children who inherited Allen traits with increasing reliability, creating a generation of individuals who possessed supernatural abilities from birth rather than acquiring them through later transformation. The children born from these arranged unions displayed remarkable consistency in their development. They walked earlier than normal infants, spoke in complete sentences before their second birthday, and demonstrated intuitive understanding of complex concepts that should have required years of education. Most significantly, they exhibited perfect emotional regulation, never displaying the tantrums or unpredictable behavior typical of childhood development. As these Allen-influenced children matured, they assumed leadership roles in their communities with precocious confidence. They became the natural mediators in disputes, the individuals others turned to for guidance, the voices that shaped local opinion. Their suggestions carried unusual weight, not through charisma or intelligence alone, but through a subtle compulsion that made resistance feel unnatural. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Allen Network had achieved something unprecedented in American history: the creation of a shadow government that operated through influence rather than authority. They controlled no official positions, claimed no territory, issued no proclamations. Yet their will shaped decisions across hundreds of communities. Their interests guided regional development, and their objectives determined the fate of thousands of families who remained unaware of their manipulation. The network's success stemmed from its fundamental understanding of human psychology. Rather than demanding obedience, they cultivated dependence. Rather than inspiring fear, they provided solutions. Rather than ruling through terror, they governed through gratitude. Their subjects believed themselves free while serving Allen interests with devoted loyalty. This sophisticated approach to control would prove far more durable than the crude violence of earlier generations. Unlike physical domination, which invited resistance and rebellion, Allen influence felt like personal choice. Their subjects made decisions that served Allen objectives while believing these choices reflected their own values and desires. The manipulation was so subtle, so perfectly calibrated to individual psychology, that exposure seemed impossible. The few individuals who began to recognize the pattern of Allen influence found themselves isolated and discredited. Their warnings fell on ears that had been conditioned to dismiss such concerns as paranoia or superstition. Evidence of Allen activities disappeared or was reinterpreted in ways that supported conventional explanations. Witnesses recanted their testimony or vanished entirely, leaving behind only confused memories and inexplicable gaps in their recollections. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Allen legacy had evolved into something far more dangerous than their ancestors could have imagined. They had transcended the limitations of geography and generation, creating a form of immortality through collective consciousness and inherited influence. Their power no longer depended on individual leaders or specific locations, but had been distributed across a network so vast and interconnected that eliminating any single component would barely diminish the whole. The stage was set for the 20th century, when Allen influence would expand beyond the rural communities of Appalachia to infiltrate the growing cities and emerging institutions of modern America. Their network possessed the infrastructure, the resources, and the refined techniques necessary to adapt to changing times while maintaining their essential objectives. By the turn of the 20th century, the Allen network had evolved beyond anything their Appalachian founders could have imagined. What began as a single cursed bloodline in Pike County had metastasized into something far more insidious, far more dangerous. The dispersed cells weren't just hiding in remote hollows anymore. They were infiltrating the very foundations of American society itself. The Industrial Revolution provided perfect cover for their expansion. As coal mines opened throughout Appalachia, as railroad lines carved through ancient mountains, as timber operations stripped forests that had stood for millennia, the Allen influence spread like poison in groundwater. They didn't just adapt to the changing times, they anticipated them, positioned themselves to profit from every upheaval, every disaster, every moment of human desperation. What made them truly terrifying by 1900 was their sophistication. Gone were the crude rituals performed around stone altars in underground chambers. The Allen network had learned to harness the same supernatural forces through methods that looked disturbingly ordinary. A handshake that lasted just a moment too long. A business contract signed with ink that seemed to shimmer strangely in lamplight. A photograph that somehow captured more than what the camera should have seen. Their recruitment had become an art form. They identified individuals at their most vulnerable moments, people facing financial ruin, terminal illness, family tragedy, professional disgrace. The approach was always subtle, always perfectly timed. A stranger offering unexpected assistance, a business opportunity that seemed too good to refuse, a chance encounter that felt like destiny. By the time their targets realized what they'd agreed to, the transformation was already irreversible. The Allen network understood that true power in the new century wouldn't come from terrorizing isolated mountain communities. It would come from controlling the systems that governed modern life. They embedded themselves in banking institutions, ensuring they could manipulate credit and currency to drive people toward desperation. They infiltrated shipping companies, creating networks for moving both goods and people with no questions asked. They established themselves in emerging industries like steel production, oil refining, and electrical generation, positioning themselves at the heart of America's industrial transformation. But perhaps their most brilliant innovation was their approach to religion. Rather than opposing established churches, they infiltrated them from within. Allen descendants became preachers, deacons, even bishops, slowly corrupting doctrine with subtle modifications that seemed innocuous to congregations but fundamentally altered the spiritual protection these institutions provided. They introduced new hymns with melodies that carried hypnotic properties. They commissioned stained glass windows that incorporated symbols from their ancient rituals. They established theological seminaries where they could shape future religious leaders. The proxy bloodlines they'd established throughout the 1880s were reaching maturity by 1900, and the results were extraordinary. These weren't merely corrupted individuals, they were something new entirely. The children born from Allen breeding programs possessed abilities that defied natural law. Some could read thoughts with casual ease. Others could influence weather patterns through focused concentration. A few demonstrated the ability to heal mortal wounds by transferring injuries to willing or unwilling recipients. Most disturbing of all, some could temporarily inhabit other people's bodies, living entire secondary lives while their hosts remained unaware of the intrusion. The Allen Network maintained detailed records of their supernatural genealogy, tracking bloodline purity and ability inheritance across generations. They discovered that certain combinations of corrupted bloodlines produced offspring with exponentially enhanced capabilities. By 1900, they were conducting breeding experiments that bordered on scientific research, carefully orchestrating marriages and pregnancies to produce individuals with specific supernatural talents. Their underground chambers had evolved into sophisticated facilities that combined ancient ritual knowledge with modern engineering. Hidden beneath seemingly ordinary buildings, these spaces featured intricate ventilation systems, electric lighting powered by mysterious energy sources, and preservation techniques that kept their ritual components fresh for decades. The chambers were connected by tunnel networks that spanned entire regions, allowing Allen operatives to travel vast distances without ever appearing on public transportation or staying in hotels where their movements might be tracked. The golden feathers that had been central to their original rituals remained crucial to their operations, but they'd developed more efficient methods of harvesting and utilizing their power. Rather than relying on occasional discoveries of the mysterious birds that produced them, they'd learned to cultivate these creatures in specially constructed aviaries hidden deep within their mountain strongholds. The breeding programs they developed for these supernatural birds paralleled their human experiments, producing specimens that generated feathers with increasingly potent properties. By 1903, the Allen Network felt confident enough to attempt their most ambitious project yet, something they called the Great Convergence. The plan was audacious in its scope, requiring coordination between every Allen cell from Georgia to Pennsylvania. They would simultaneously activate ritual sites across Appalachia during the winter solstice, creating a supernatural network that would allow them to exert influence over the entire eastern seaboard. The preparation took 3 years of meticulous planning. Each cell had to prepare specific ritual components, timing their acquisition and refinement to ensure maximum potency during the convergence ceremony. They needed precisely 144 golden feathers, each one blessed in blood from a different Allen bloodline. They required soil samples from every original homestead their ancestors had occupied. Most challenging of all, they needed willing sacrifices from each proxy family they'd established, individuals who understood exactly what they were offering and chose to participate anyway. The ritual sites themselves had to be prepared with mathematical precision. Ancient survey techniques were combined with emerging technologies to ensure perfect alignment between locations. Telegraph lines were secretly modified to carry more than just electrical signals, creating a communication network that would allow instantaneous coordination across hundreds of miles. Railroad schedules were subtly influenced to ensure that certain cargo shipments arrived at specific locations at exactly the right moments. The night of December 21st, 1906, marked the culmination of everything the Allen Network had worked toward since their original patriarch first encountered whatever dwelt in those Kentucky caves. At precisely midnight, in 17 locations across the Appalachian region, Allen descendants and their proxy families began the Great Convergence ritual. What happened that night was witnessed by hundreds of people, though most of their accounts were dismissed as hysteria or fabrication. Telegraph operators reported receiving messages in languages that didn't exist, transmitted at speeds that should have been impossible with 1906 technology. Railroad engineers described seeing lights in the mountains that moved in perfect geometric patterns, as though the peaks themselves were communicating with each other. Residents of communities near Allen territories reported that every clock in their towns stopped working simultaneously, remaining frozen for exactly 47 minutes. But the most disturbing reports came from the participants themselves. Allen descendants who survived the ritual described experiencing a collective consciousness that connected them not just to each other, but to something vast and ancient that existed beyond normal human perception. They claimed to have received knowledge about future events, technological innovations that wouldn't be invented for decades, and political upheavals that would reshape the world. Some reported seeing visions of wars that would consume entire continents, of diseases that would kill millions, of social movements that would fundamentally alter human civilization. The Great Convergence succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but success came with unexpected consequences. The ritual didn't just create a network of supernatural influence, it attracted attention from forces that the Allen descendants hadn't anticipated. Within months of the convergence, reports began circulating about federal investigators who seemed to possess unusual knowledge about supernatural phenomena. These weren't ordinary government agents. They appeared to be part of a secretive organization that had been monitoring supernatural activity throughout American history. More troubling were the other families that began emerging from hiding. The Allen network discovered they weren't the only bloodline that had made bargains with supernatural entities. Across America, similar groups had been developing their own power bases, their own networks of influence, their own approaches to harnessing forces beyond human understanding. The Great Convergence had inadvertently announced the Allen Network's existence to competitors who had remained carefully hidden for generations. By 1910, what historians would later call the Shadow War had begun. Multiple supernatural factions were maneuvering for control of American institutions, each believing their approach to otherworldly power was superior. The Allen Network found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts, defending their territories from rival bloodlines while simultaneously expanding their influence into new regions and industries. The competition forced rapid innovation in their methods. Allen descendants developed new techniques for concealing their supernatural abilities, creating personas that could function in normal society while maintaining their connection to the network's collective consciousness. They learned to identify and neutralize rival supernatural influences, sometimes through direct confrontation, but more often through subtle sabotage that appeared to be natural disasters or business failures. Their infiltration of American institutions accelerated dramatically during this period. By 1915, Allen descendants, or their proxies, held positions in major banks, shipping companies, steel mills, oil refineries, newspaper publishing houses, and government agencies. They weren't just participating in American economic expansion, they were directing it, ensuring that industrial development served their long-term supernatural objectives. The outbreak of World War I provided unprecedented opportunities for the Allen Network to expand their influence globally. They positioned themselves as suppliers of critical materials to the war effort, using their supernatural abilities to locate mineral deposits, predict weather patterns that would affect shipping, and influence the decisions of military commanders. But their most significant contribution to the war effort was their development of what they called enhancement programs for soldiers. Working through military medical facilities, Allen descendants began experimenting with ways to temporarily grant supernatural abilities to ordinary soldiers. The techniques were crude and often fatal, but the few subjects who survived the process demonstrated remarkable improvements in strength, endurance, and combat effectiveness. These enhanced soldiers became the backbone of several elite military units, though their existence was classified at the highest levels of government. The war also provided cover for the Allen Network to establish international connections. They made contact with similar supernatural bloodlines in Europe, discovering that their approach to otherworldly power was part of a global phenomenon that had been developing for centuries. These international connections would prove crucial to their survival as the post-war period brought new challenges to their operations. By 1920, the Allen Network had achieved something their founders never could have imagined. They had created a supernatural infrastructure that spanned continents, a hidden system of power and influence that operated parallel to normal human civilization. They controlled resources worth millions of dollars, commanded the loyalty of thousands of individuals, and possessed knowledge that gave them tremendous advantage in predicting and shaping future events. But their greatest achievement was also their greatest vulnerability. The network had become so large, so complex, so interconnected that it was increasingly difficult to maintain the secrecy that had protected them for decades. Each new recruitment brought the risk of exposure. Each expansion into new territory created potential conflicts with rival factions. Each demonstration of supernatural ability increased the chances of attracting unwanted attention from government investigators or religious authorities. The Allen descendants understood that the world was changing faster than ever before. The technologies emerging in the 1920s, radio communication, aviation, mass production, would create both opportunities and threats for their operations. They would need to adapt once again, developing new methods for maintaining their influence in an increasingly connected and monitored world. As the decade progressed, they began preparing for what their enhanced precognitive abilities suggested would be the most challenging period in their history. The visions received during the Great Convergence had shown them glimpses of economic collapse, global warfare, and social upheaval on a scale never before witnessed. But they had also shown them opportunities to emerge from these catastrophes stronger than ever, positioned to guide human civilization toward a future that would serve their ultimate supernatural objectives. The stage was set for the Allen Network's greatest test and their ultimate triumph. By 1910, the Allen Network had successfully orchestrated convergences across 7 regions. But their true mastery revealed itself not in grand displays of power, but in the subtle art of human psychological manipulation. What they discovered during their decades of experimentation was that the human mind, when properly conditioned, could become their most effective tool for expansion. The feathers they had cultivated and harvested weren't merely supernatural artifacts, they were psychological keys that could unlock and reshape human consciousness itself. Selected individuals, chosen for their positions of influence or their particular psychological vulnerabilities, would be exposed to carefully controlled doses of the feather essence. Unlike their earlier crude methods of direct supernatural intervention, this approach required patience and precision. The essence would be introduced through seemingly innocent means, a gift of locally sourced honey from Allen-controlled apiaries, spring water from their territories, or even through the air itself during carefully orchestrated community gatherings. The initial effects were imperceptible. Recipients would experience enhanced clarity of thought, improved decision-making abilities, and a subtle sense of confidence that others found compelling. These early stages were designed to create dependency, as subjects would unconsciously seek out more exposure to maintain these enhanced states. Local leaders who had been softened would make decisions that inexplicably favored Allen interests, while never quite understanding why these choices seemed so obviously correct. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, a psychiatrist who had been investigating unusual behavioral patterns in several Appalachian communities, documented her observations in a series of encrypted journals discovered decades later. Her notes describe subjects who exhibited what she termed directed intuition, a phenomenon where individuals would make complex decisions based on insights that seemed to emerge from nowhere, yet always aligned with a particular agenda they couldn't articulate. The most disturbing aspect of her research was the discovery that these individuals weren't being controlled in any traditional sense. Their personalities remained intact, their free will apparently uncompromised. Instead, their perception of reality had been subtly altered. They genuinely believed their influenced decisions were their own, supported by logic and reasoning that felt entirely natural to them. When questioned about their choices, they would provide rational explanations that satisfied even skeptical observers. The Allen network had essentially learned to edit human consciousness, removing certain possibilities from consideration while amplifying others. A sheriff might become incapable of perceiving evidence that would implicate Allen interests, not because he was willfully ignoring it, but because his mind would literally not process it as relevant information. A banker would find compelling reasons to approve loans that benefited Allen Enterprises while discovering insurmountable obstacles to financing their competitors. This psychological manipulation operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The feather essence created neurological changes that enhanced susceptibility to suggestion, while the Allen's proxy families provided the social reinforcement necessary to maintain these altered states. Communities under their influence developed what appeared to be organic cultural shifts, but were actually carefully orchestrated psychological environments designed to normalize and reinforce the desired behavioral changes. These were gathering places, often disguised as churches, community centers, or fraternal organizations, where the influenced would congregate regularly. The buildings themselves were constructed according to specific architectural principles that amplified the psychological effects of the feather essence. The arrangement of rooms, the angles of walls, even the materials used in construction were all calculated to create subtle but powerful psychological impacts on regular occupants. Within these chambers, the Allens would conduct what appeared to be normal community activities, religious services, social meetings, or educational programs. However, these gatherings served as reinforcement sessions where the psychological conditioning would be strengthened and refined. Participants would leave these meetings feeling energized and purposeful, carrying with them subliminal instructions that would guide their actions in the weeks to come. The true genius of this system was its self-perpetuating nature. Once a sufficient number of individuals in a community had been softened and conditioned, they would unconsciously work to bring others into the fold. They would organize community events, recommend participation in local organizations, and create social pressure that naturally drew new candidates into the network's sphere of influence. The system expanded organically, appearing to grow through normal social dynamics while actually following carefully designed psychological patterns. Regional variations in the conditioning process revealed the network's adaptability. In mining communities, the emphasis was placed on safety and prosperity, with conditioned individuals making decisions that seemed to prioritize these values while actually serving Allen interests. In agricultural areas, the focus shifted to land stewardship and community cooperation. In more urban environments, the conditioning emphasized progress and modernization, leading to development decisions that consolidated Allen influence over emerging infrastructure. The network also developed techniques for handling resistance. Individuals who proved difficult to condition weren't simply eliminated, as might have been the case in earlier decades. The conditioned members of their communities would gradually withdraw from these resistant individuals, not through any conscious decision, but through subtle psychological compulsions that made interaction with the unconditioned feel uncomfortable or unrewarding. Over time, resistant individuals would find themselves increasingly isolated, their warnings about strange occurrences dismissed by neighbors who had been conditioned to find such concerns irrational or paranoid. Many would eventually leave the area entirely, while others would gradually succumb to the social pressure and accept conditioning as a path back to community acceptance. The network's psychological operations extended beyond individual conditioning to encompass entire cultural narratives. They began to influence how communities understood their own histories, emphasizing certain events while causing others to fade from collective memory. Local legends that might have served as warnings about supernatural influence were gradually transformed into quaint folklore, stripped of their original meaning and power. Educational institutions under Allen influence began to subtly alter their curricula, not through dramatic changes that might attract attention, but through minor adjustments that accumulated over time. Children would learn versions of local history that omitted crucial details about the Allen family's arrival and early activities. Scientific education would emphasize rational materialism in ways that made students less likely to consider supernatural explanations for unusual phenomena. By 1920, the network had achieved something unprecedented in the history of supernatural influence over human societies. They had created a system of control that was virtually undetectable even to those within it. The conditioned individuals weren't enslaved or obviously manipulated. They were simply living within a carefully constructed reality that channeled their free will toward predetermined outcomes. This psychological dominance allowed the network to weather challenges that would have destroyed cruder supernatural entities. When federal investigators arrived to look into reports of unusual activities, they would find communities that appeared completely normal. Local officials would cooperate fully with investigations, genuinely believing they had nothing to hide. Witnesses would provide testimony that was technically truthful, but somehow always missed the crucial details that might have revealed the network's existence. The investigators themselves weren't immune to the conditioning process. Extended stays in Allen-influenced communities would gradually affect their perceptions, making them less likely to pursue certain lines of inquiry or to interpret evidence in ways that might threaten the network. Many investigations that began with serious intent would conclude with findings that attributed unusual reports to natural phenomena, local folklore, or simple misunderstandings. The network's psychological mastery also enabled them to infiltrate and influence organizations far beyond their original Appalachian territories. By the 1920s, they had established footholds in major cities, using their conditioned agents to identify and recruit new candidates for influence. Urban environments presented different challenges, but the fundamental techniques remained effective. Professional associations, social clubs, and political organizations in cities across the eastern United States began to show signs of Allen influence. The changes were subtle but significant: shifts in policy priorities, alterations in professional standards, and modifications in social norms that gradually created environments more conducive to the network's goals. The conditioned members of these organizations would champion these changes enthusiastically, providing rational justifications that satisfied even careful scrutiny. The network's influence on emerging technologies was particularly significant. As radio broadcasting began to develop, Allen-influenced investors and engineers ensured that certain technical standards were adopted. These standards included specifications that seemed purely technical but actually created subtle, Psychological effects on listeners. Radio programs broadcast from Allen-influenced stations would carry subliminal elements that enhanced the conditioning process, reaching audiences far beyond the network's traditional territories. The development of modern advertising techniques was also shaped by Allen influence. Conditioned individuals working in emerging advertising agencies would develop methods that seemed designed to sell products, but actually served to make populations more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The techniques they pioneered would later be adopted throughout the industry, creating a society-wide increase in psychological vulnerability that the network could exploit. As the 1920s progressed, the Allen network had transformed from a localized supernatural threat into something far more insidious, a shadow influence that touched virtually every aspect of American society. Their success lay not in dramatic displays of power, but in the patient, systematic reshaping of human consciousness itself. They had learned to make their will indistinguishable from human choice, their agenda invisible within the fabric of everyday life. The implications of their psychological mastery extended far beyond their immediate goals. They had essentially created a new model for supernatural influence over human civilization, one that operated through manipulation of perception and consciousness rather than direct supernatural intervention. This approach was not only more effective than traditional methods, but also more sustainable and scalable. The network's ultimate goal was becoming clearer: the creation of a human society that would willingly evolve in directions that served their supernatural agenda. They weren't seeking to rule humanity in any conventional sense, but rather to guide human development toward outcomes that would eventually transform the species itself. The psychological conditioning was merely the first step in a process that would ultimately reshape human nature to align with their otherworldly objectives. This transformation would be gradual and seemingly natural, appearing to emerge from humanity's own choices and development rather than external influence. The conditioned populations would enthusiastically support changes that served the network's goals, believing themselves to be pioneers of progress and enlightenment. The shadow of the Allen influence had grown so vast by the mid-20th century that distinguishing between natural human development and their orchestrated manipulation became nearly impossible. What appeared to be progress, innovation, and social evolution was increasingly revealed as a carefully choreographed dance toward an outcome that served interests far removed from human welfare. The proxies had become so numerous, so integrated into every level of society, that the Allen agenda was now simply the American agenda, disguised as manifest destiny and wrapped in the rhetoric of freedom. By 1945, as the nation emerged victorious from global conflict, the Allen Network had positioned itself to capitalize on America's new role as a world superpower. Their proxies held key positions in the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, the expanding military-industrial complex, and the burgeoning suburban development projects that would reshape the American landscape. What the public celebrated as unprecedented prosperity was actually the fruit of decades of supernatural manipulation. Each suburb built according to geometries that enhanced psychic receptivity. Each highway system designed to channel human movement in patterns that strengthened the collective unconscious binding. Shopping centers weren't merely commercial spaces, but carefully designed temples of consumption, their layouts following sacred geometric principles that induced specific mental states. The placement of stores, the width of corridors, even the frequency of fluorescent lighting was calibrated to maximize what the Allen network called acquisitive trance, a state of consciousness where humans became most susceptible to long-term behavioral programming. Television programming represented another vector for mass influence. Allen proxies within the emerging broadcast industry ensured that certain symbols, color combinations, and audio frequencies appeared consistently across seemingly unrelated shows. These weren't crude attempts at subliminal messaging, but sophisticated applications of what they had learned through generations of ritual practice. The flickering light of television screens created a hypnotic state that made viewers particularly receptive to psychic suggestion, while the shared cultural experiences of popular shows created collective thought forms that could be manipulated by those who understood their structure. The suburban family home itself became a containment unit for human consciousness. The standardized floor plans, popular in post-war developments, weren't chosen for efficiency or cost, but for their ability to create specific energy patterns within domestic spaces. The typical ranch house, with its emphasis on horizontal lines and compartmentalized rooms, was designed to fragment family consciousness, making individuals within the household easier to influence, while weakening the natural psychic bonds that might otherwise provide protection against external manipulation. Educational systems underwent similar restructuring, though the changes appeared to be natural responses to the demands of an increasingly complex technological society. The shift from classical education focused on critical thinking and cultural transmission to standardized curricula emphasizing conformity and measurable outcomes served the Allen agenda perfectly. Students were taught to accept authority without question, to value material success above spiritual development, and to view themselves as isolated individuals rather than members of interconnected communities. The Allen network understood that true control required not just influence over conscious thought, but domination of the unconscious mind, where fundamental beliefs and emotional responses originated. Through their proxies in the emerging fields of psychology and psychiatry, they promoted therapeutic approaches that isolated individuals from traditional support systems while making them dependent on professional intervention. The concept of mental illness was expanded to pathologize many forms of spiritual experience and intuitive knowing that might otherwise allow people to recognize supernatural manipulation. Religious institutions, already weakened by decades of Allen infiltration, were further compromised through the promotion of theological movements that emphasized individual salvation over community responsibility. The prosperity gospel that gained popularity in the 1950s was particularly useful to the Allen agenda, as it taught believers that material success was a sign of divine favor, making them more willing to participate in the very systems that were enslaving them spiritually. The Allen network's influence extended into the realm of medicine through their proxies in pharmaceutical companies and medical schools. The shift toward chemical solutions for psychological and spiritual problems served multiple purposes. It normalized the idea that human consciousness could and should be altered through external substances. It created dependencies that could be exploited for further control, and it generated enormous profits that could be reinvested in expanding the network's influence. Perhaps most insidiously, the Allen network began to influence the very language used to describe human experience. Through their proxies in academia, publishing, and media, they promoted terminology that fragmented holistic understanding into separate, manageable categories. The concept of mental health replaced older notions of spiritual well being, while self improvement substituted for genuine spiritual development. This linguistic manipulation made it increasingly difficult for people to even conceptualize alternatives to the systems that were controlling them. The network's mastery of what they called cultural seeding reached its peak during the 1960s counterculture movement. What appeared to be a spontaneous rebellion against established authority was actually a carefully orchestrated release valve designed to channel dissent into forms that ultimately served the Allen agenda. The promotion of drug use, particularly psychedelics, wasn't intended to expand consciousness, but to create temporary states of vulnerability that could be exploited for deeper programming. The emphasis on individual liberation over collective action ensured that the movement would ultimately fragment into ineffective subgroups focused on personal gratification rather than systemic change. The sexual revolution of the same period served similar purposes, breaking down traditional family structures and community bonds that had historically provided protection against supernatural influence. While marketed as liberation, the resulting social fragmentation made individuals more isolated and therefore more susceptible to manipulation. The Allen network understood that humans derive their spiritual strength from authentic relationships and community connections. By disrupting these bonds, they could more easily harvest the psychic energy they required. By the 1970s, the Allen influence had become so pervasive that it began to manifest in environmental changes that reflected the spiritual corruption of the landscape itself. The increasing frequency of natural disasters, the degradation of ecosystems, and the appearance of new diseases all reflected the energetic pollution created by decades of supernatural manipulation. The network had succeeded in creating a feedback loop where human consciousness shaped physical reality in ways that further served their agenda. The rise of personal computing and eventually the internet would provide the Allen network with their most powerful tool yet for consciousness manipulation. The networked nature of digital communication allowed for unprecedented surveillance and influence over human thought patterns, while the addictive nature of digital interfaces created new forms of dependency that could be exploited for control. The promise of connection and information access masked the reality that these technologies were designed to isolate individuals while flooding them with carefully curated content designed to reinforce desired behavioral patterns. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Allen network had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a global civilization whose every institution, from the most intimate family structures to the most abstract financial systems, served an agenda that was fundamentally alien to human flourishing. The proxies had become so numerous and so thoroughly integrated into society that the distinction between human and Allen consciousness had largely disappeared. Most people now carried within themselves the seeds of their own spiritual enslavement, passed down through generations of psychological conditioning and energetic manipulation. The network's ultimate goal was becoming clear: the complete transformation of human consciousness into something that would serve their purposes while appearing to maintain free will and individual agency. This wasn't mere domination, but a form of spiritual parasitism that would allow them to harvest human creative and emotional energy indefinitely, while their hosts remained unaware of the true nature of their condition. These stories reveal how desperation and isolation can twist human nature into something unrecognizable. The Allen family and their dark contemporaries remind us that some bargains extract a price far beyond what we initially offer. Whether these accounts represent literal truth or the collective fears of mountain communities struggling against poverty and hardship, they serve as warnings about the dangers of seeking power through forbidden means. In the end, the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachia continue to guard their secrets, leaving us to wonder what other shadows move through those ancient peaks.